President of Public Policy, if I get that right, for Americans United.
Yep.
And in that capacity, she does a lot of wonderful things for the organization. She actually was working on behalf of the ACLU of Georgia before then, so she's very knowledgeable about how our legislature works as well. So we really couldn't have a better person to talk to us tonight about church and state separation issues as they played out in the Georgia legislature in 2023. The format is going to be, I should have introduced myself. I'm Ayman Fadl. I'm secretary of the Central Savannah River chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. We are in Augusta, Georgia. And we are going to be having Maggie talk for about 30 minutes. So, we're not going to be a strict timer on that. And then she's agreed to take some Q&A. And if you have any questions for the remote attendees, please type them in your question box. And so we'll hopefully take those. And then at the end, we'll have some announcements about some local events. I am going to promote, before we get started and at the end, the Summit for Religious Freedom, which is a big event that Americans United is hoping to launch our national recommitment to church and state separation. And that's going to be April 22nd through 24th in Washington, D.C. For those of you who cannot travel there, there is a remote component for a measly $40 you can buy, which I've already noted all the sessions I want to attend remotely. And so be there if you can, be there in person or via the internet. All right. So with that, go ahead, please, Maggie, and let's hear from you.
All right, great. First I will say I'm a little concerned that I'm going to go from it being sunny outside to not sunny outside. So if the room gets really dark, I might stand up and turn another light on just as a warning beforehand. Again, I'm at my mom's house, so.
Hold on just a second. We have a problem with the audio. Okay, hang on just a second.
Okay.
We got an audio problem in the room. Just a moment. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Okay. So I'll just start. I'm really excited to be with you tonight. As you said, I used to work at the ACLU of Georgia. I lived in Atlanta for 5 years and worked at the legislature. And so Georgia continues to hold a special place in my heart. And I'm always looking for an excuse to talk about, go to, do something with Georgia. And while Nick Nordowitz, who is our state person, follows the legislation in 49 other states, I get to still follow what's happening in Georgia. And so that is why I'm here with you tonight. And even though Nick is just one person, we do a lot of work in the state. As I was saying, Nick's just one person, but we do a ton of work in the states, even with one person. So between January, when most state legislatures gavel in their sessions, and now, AU's policy team has tracked more than 1,500 bills, and we have sent almost 70 letters to legislators in 19 states. We also created a toolkit to fight private school vouchers, and we've sent that out to, I guess we sent 250 copies out to legislators and activists around the country. We've also sent a lot of them electronically, and we did send the toolkit in person. I actually hand-delivered the toolkit to all of the members of the Georgia Education Committee who oppose vouchers to help them prepare for your voucher fight. We offer legal analysis, talking points, backgrounders, policy strategy advice, and we've done that in numerous battles this year, including battles on school prayers, so-called religious freedom bills, and even a creationism bill this year, which we haven't seen those in a long time. So it's pretty bold that that's coming up again. And we actually worked really closely with Representative Schofield from the Atlanta area on many of our issues. And at her invitation, we actually briefed Georgia legislatures on 3 separate occasions on religious freedom issues. So we have been pretty active in your state. So this year, I think in many ways, Georgia is sort of really typical of the issues that we've seen across the country. So a lot of the fights we saw in Georgia Maybe we saw one or two of them in other fights, but they were all sort of in Georgia. And to be honest, Georgia fared a lot better than most other places. And I think that is thanks to people like you on the ground who are fighting for church-state separation and for our rights, and, you know, taking a stand on a lot of these issues. So I'll start with trans rights. So this year we have seen an unprecedented attack against trans people, or on trans people across the country. So, and it's in particular on trans youth. Sadly, Georgia wasn't able to escape this trend this year. Georgia passed, and the governor already signed into law, SB 140, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. SB 40 is an anti-trans bill that prevents transgender, non-binary, and non-conforming youth from receiving gender-affirming care in Georgia. Under the law that's now passed, doctors will be allowed to prescribe minors drugs that block the effects of puberty, but they cannot use hormone therapy treatments or surgery, although minors who are already taking hormone treatments will be allowed to continue taking them. This bill is really terrible. It defies the consensus of nearly every single major medical and mental health association. It restricts Georgia families' access to health care for transgender youth, allows government interference in families' private health care decisions, and it jeopardizes healthcare providers' ability to do their jobs. It also sets a dangerous precedent that politicians now have the power to meddle in people's healthcare decisions and decide to reject evidence-based guidelines or attack healthcare providers to make a political point. And as people dedicated to the principle of church-state separation, I think you and I all know that this violates a core principle of religious freedom. We know that this ban is motivated by one particular religious belief around gender, and they're putting that into the law, and they're imposing that upon all people of Georgia, and trying to make us live by their particular religion, which is really problematic. It is a terrible precedent. And of course, this has tragic consequences for trans youth and their families. And it is really terrifying for families and youth across the country that these bills are passing everywhere. So that did pass. It's now in the hands of folks who litigate. I honestly don't know what steps people are taking. I do know that Jeff Graham from Georgia Equality is amazing and did a ton of work on this. I know the ACLU worked against this. And I know that there was is quite an impressive fight, and they thought that they almost won, but it came out that it passed, and so that was really disappointing, but a really hard fight. So that's the first bill I think is really noteworthy from the year. On a positive note, though, in the LGBTQ space, Georgia was able to escape a passage of a Florida-like "Don't Say Gay" bill. Don't Say Gay bills promote the dangerous misconception that discussions of LGBTQ people are inappropriate for young people, and that they're topics that you shouldn't even broach. They pressure school boards to develop policies targeting LGBTQ students and parents. And as we know, every child deserves a quality education in a school community where they feel safe and supported. So these are really problematic bills. But this one, in Georgia, there was a big win. So this bill was scheduled for a hearing. Jeff Graham, again, leading this fight, and a lot of other people in Georgia had really prepared for this hearing. There were 35 people signed up to testify in opposition. That includes the PTA, the School Boards Association, the Georgia Teacher of the Year was there, a principal from a local elementary school. So they really had an impressive list of folks testifying against the bill. There were 2 people who signed up to support the bill, so 35 plus to 2. But the chairman of the committee started the meeting. He skipped to the end of the list, which was the Southern Baptist Mission Board. Their representative got up, and I think like you probably thought, oh, they were just going to skip all the people who opposed it and pick someone who supported it. But there, I should apologize. Another thing about my parents' house is we have 3 grandfathers' clocks, and they all go off every 15 minutes, and I don't know how to turn them off. So, so there might be some clocks chiming in this presentation. But so he skipped to the end with the Southern Baptist Mission Board, and their representative got up and testified that they had concerns about the bill. They were concerned about unintended consequences, and then they pulled their support for the bill. So that was quite a surprise. And then one of the Democratic members of the committee quickly moved to table the bill. And then that passed with a unanimous vote from the committee. And tabling it means you sort of put it aside and then you have to have another vote to bring it back. And what this did was essentially table the bill for the year. So it was a spectacular and very dramatic win that was very well deserved and very exciting given the hard fight that everyone was fighting on all the other issues. So a win for Georgia on that really tough bill. And then the next bill I really want to talk about is the private school voucher vote. This, again, is another big win for Georgia. And it's really fantastic too, because it comes on the heels of a lot of voucher losses. So the success of the private school voucher advocates, I think this year is unprecedented. They passed new voucher bills in Arkansas, Iowa, and Utah. And not only did they create new programs, but they created statewide bills. Now, in the past, what normally has happened is they would pass small bills because they couldn't get through these big, large statewide programs where all students would be eligible. So they would pick vulnerable populations, sort of like what Georgia did in the past. Georgia already has a voucher for kids with disabilities, which, though really problematic, particularly because students with disabilities that take voucher programs actually end up forfeiting their federal protections, their federal civil rights protections that they get as students with disabilities. So it's a really problematic program, but it's narrow. So you will often see across the states bills that say things like, students living in poverty get a voucher, students in the foster care system get a voucher, and they'll sort of pick, again, vulnerable populations. What they did this year, after they did it in Arizona last year, is they are just pushing through huge programs that are billions of dollars and really just go in for the kill of public schools all in one fell swoop. And it will be really interesting to see how they play out as the impact on our public schools. So we had 3 states, as I said, who passed new voucher programs that were statewide. Florida, they already have, I think, 5 voucher programs, but they also passed a bill that expanded vouchers to be statewide. And then you have Georgia, who came in and they were trying to pass a voucher school-wide, and even with the push of the governor, weren't able to do it. So voucher programs, I should start by saying the success of voucher proponents is not by accident or coincidental. There is tons of voucher money going into elections. The last election, it's a lot of DeVos money, a lot of Koch brothers money, and it is definitely showing. So a lot of this is money. And a lot of it is part of their bigger strategy. So I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about critical race theory, right? And so the other side is constantly talking about how we are teaching critical race theory in our K through 12 schools, which we are not. And they are making up this false controversy saying that we are teaching our kids to feel guilty for being white, when actually what they're really doing is teaching accurate history about race and other issues. So the architect behind the CRT controversy, making it a controversy, is this guy called Christopher Rufo. And Christopher Rufo has admitted that his real goal behind pushing anti-CRT bills and language and rhetoric is really about the end goal of private school vouchers. So what he has said is, we are, the quote, "We are right now preparing a strategy of laying siege to the institutions, our public schools. And in practice, it means that they are promoting the traditional Republican school choice agenda, which is private school vouchers, charter schools, and homeschooling." So the idea is that they create distrust in our public schools that makes people say, I don't really want to send my kids to public schools because of this CRT thing or this other thing. Maybe vouchers are really the way to go. So those waging attacks on trans kids in public schools Often when you ask them the solution, they will say it's to give out a school voucher and people can decide whether to go to schools that protect trans kids or not. Supporters of the coach in the Bremerton case, the Kennedy v. Bremerton case, which was our case, where the coach claimed he had a right to pray at the 50-yard line with his football team. On Fox News, there was someone who there said the solution to this, right, is we'll have school vouchers. So the kids who want to pray can go to a school that prays, and the public school kids, you know, we just have no public schools. You just go wherever you want to go. The people opposing policies to contain the spread of COVID-19 in the name of personal liberty, opposing masks and vaccines in public schools, they're using that still to advocate for school vouchers. So during the COVID vaccine or the COVID pandemic, they were giving out vouchers to students who wanted to wear a mask. They were giving out vouchers to kids who didn't want to wear a mask. And so again, they're just sort of drumming up controversy, and the solution is take a private school voucher and go to a private school. Even in the area of school shootings, sadly, the Heritage Foundation has testified that one of the ways to protect our kids against school violence and shootings is to give kids a private school voucher, which I have no idea how that works. There is no science behind any of this, but everything points back to drumming up controversy in the public schools and trying to privatize our public schools. So I think it's really important for us to remember that public education is not a private consumer good. It's a public good, and educating our children benefits all of us. That is why all of us, those without school-age children, those without any children, pay into the system. Education is necessary to ensure our children can find fulfilling jobs, live happy lives, but it's also critical to creating a functional democracy. It improves our communities, reduces inequalities, and public education in particular helps forge common experiences. 9 out of 10 students attend public schools. And while it's true, our public schools, like the communities we live in, are far from desegregated, they are far from perfect. It is one of the institutions we were most likely to encounter, interact with, get to know people of different races, religions, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And so there are really great things about our public schools, and we have to remember, again, that it's more than a transactional situation. It is more than a consumer good. It is really about preserving our democracy and equality and opportunity for everyone. And so we can't abdicate our responsibility for educating our nation's children to private entities, which are often looking to make a profit and that don't have the same obligation to the public good. Another thing I think it's really important for people to know about vouchers, and one of the reasons I'm going through a lot of this information is because you're going to see the same fight next year, right? They're going to come back with this private voucher bill, and so I want to make sure that some of this information is known about vouchers. A lot of people don't know where vouchers came from. And voucher programs were born in the South as a way to allow white kids to evade integration orders in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education. To avoid having their kids go to school with Black students, white parents created private schools, often called segregation academies, that accepted only white students. That way, Black students could attend the public schools, but the white students wouldn't attend the public schools. And they didn't want to give up the money, so they created voucher programs. And they were pitched in the exact same way as vouchers are pitched today. They're pitched as freedom of choice and school choice. And they just sort of didn't talk about the race issues, even though they were all motivated by the race issues. So these programs were struck down by the courts in the 50s and 60s, and they sprung back up in the 80s and 90s. They dropped the racist messaging, but they kept the exact same justifications of parental choice and parental rights. But they really can't escape their racist origins. And even today, though many voucher programs bar race discrimination, these provisions have no enforcement mechanisms to enforce their race discrimination prohibitions. And in addition, national data shows that private school vouchers still exacerbate segregation today. So there's a huge problem with where they came from, and it's really no surprise that they all lack non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ kids, sex discrimination, disability discrimination, on and on and on. These schools usually get out of all non-discrimination protections. And, you know, I'll just say a few more things about them, which is that they don't work. Repeated studies of voucher programs across the country show that they actually result in worse test scores. Recent studies in Louisiana, Indiana, and Ohio demonstrate that the kids who use vouchers actually have worse academic outcomes than their peers. Studies in Milwaukee, Cleveland, and DC show that they have no improvement in reading or math. So the science isn't even behind vouchers. It is really purely ideological, because, and it is pushed by both. It's a combination of libertarians who want to privatize, and then white Christian nationalists, right, who want to indoctrinate our kids in religious doctrine. So that takes us to Georgia. Again, Georgia did an amazing job. It passed through the House, or I'm sorry, it passed through the Senate on a party line vote, and then it went to the floor, where it failed to pass, 85 to 89. One Democrat voted for it, and 16 Republicans voted against it. And we are seeing this also across the country, that rural Republicans oppose private school vouchers because they don't have any voucher schools in their area. There are no private schools to go to. So I'm sure you all can imagine how this scenario plays out in Georgia, where the public school in a rural area is really the center of the town. It could be the main employer. It's often where your social events are. All of your kids go to one school. There's no private schools around, but then they would be taking your taxpayer dollars out of your rural public school to send them to private schools, which are going to be predominantly in cities, right? And I was at the Georgia legislature long enough to know that the rural legislators really didn't like it when you took their money and you gave it to Atlanta. And so that is really a lot of what is at the center of those 16 Republicans voting against the private school voucher. But it will be up again when the legislature convenes again next year. This bill will have made it through the Senate. And so there's going to be another fight. So it seems to me as though, you know, lobbying and working on this bill on the off session makes a lot of sense to reinforce the opposition to private school vouchers, and then fighting really hard, particularly with some of these Republicans, to make sure that they don't flip their vote. So that is sort of the summary. I think the top 3 most important bills. I know that there's other bills that were out there that I might be able to comment on. But before I do that, there was also a request that I just talk a little bit about the legislative process. It can be really, really confusing, particularly in Georgia, about how bills die and then spring up again and get added to other bills, and how does this happen? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that just really quickly. So Georgia has 40 legislative days, but it's not a consecutive 40 legislative days. They can start and stop the clock whenever they want. So they can meet on Monday, turn off the clock on Tuesday and Wednesday, meet on Thursday, turn off the clock for 3 weeks, start up again. So they can really have the clock go however they want. This year, it's my understanding that the speaker, a new speaker after David Ralston passed away, who actually set the calendar at the very beginning of the year, which is the first I've ever heard of them doing that, which is kind of nice because you know what to expect. But it's not just they start on the first date and it goes for 40 days. So the way a bill works is the bill is introduced, and then the Speaker of the House, we'll just start with the House, the Speaker of the House, and then I guess in the Senate, I think it has changed over the years, whether it's the Lieutenant Governor or the Secretary Pro Tem, but someone over there is in charge of putting a bill in a committee. Some of it's very easy and very obvious what committee that bill goes in, but there's definitely wiggle room. So for instance, for years, Lindsey Tippins in the Senate was the chair of the Education Committee, and he was a Republican who hated vouchers. And so on the Senate side, they started getting wise to that, and so they started putting bills that should have gone in the Education Committee in a different committee so that they could push it through. So they will sometimes do things like that, put a committee in a bill if they want to hide it away that it'll never get out, or if they really want to move it, they can sort of finagle and come up with an excuse for why a bill goes on another committee. So there can be that work. So it goes to a committee, and then that committee chair, though he has oversight from leadership above him, gets to decide how to move the bill. So sometimes they will just have a committee hearing, the full committee will have a hearing, and they will, at the end of that hearing, vote on a bill. And they might have several bills in that hearing. So they might take several votes. It might be dedicated just to one bill. So they can do it that way, a hearing with a vote. They can also just have a hearing and have no vote. Sometimes they will have a hearing at a separate time and then call them back for a vote. So there's really a lot of wiggle room. They can have a subcommittee hearing and then move it to the full committee, or they don't have to. So there's lots of opportunity for them to sort of manipulate how they want the process to go. Sometimes also they will say that they're having a hearing, and you'll get there and they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, we only have time for 3 minutes or 3 minutes of testifying on each side. And so though it's a hearing, it's very, very limited in who can speak. So again, they have a lot of leeway to do this however they want. And oftentimes, sadly, they really err on the side of having less public comment. So that's the committee spot. So it gets through a committee. So it might be the Judiciary Committee, the Education Committee. Once it's through that committee, it goes to a second committee called the Rules Committee. So both the House and the Senate have a Rules Committee. Their job is to decide what bill gets put on the floor. And they have very different ways of working in the Senate and the House on how their Rules Committee works. In the Senate, it's a lot more law and order rules. So the Rules Committee will meet, and they will vote up bills, and then they will come up with a calendar, the Rules Committee calendar in the Senate, and it will list all the bills. It will be in order, and the lieutenant governor on the floor of the Senate, the next time it's meeting, will call those bills up in order. So whatever order it's in, you can expect it to be in that order. Now they can table bills and bring them back, but generally they are in that order. And it has to go through the Rules Committee prior to that day to get on the floor. The House is very much different. They will have a committee, they'll put a bunch of bills on there, the speaker can pick them up in any order they want, or if they did a bunch of bills and they want to bring up another bill, they can just take a break from the House floor, and then the Rules Committee will meet and they'll just add some more bills on, and then that afternoon they'll be hearing more bills. So they can really manipulate the system again so that people at home don't know what's happening. A lot of times when I was there, the lobbyists who would be sitting there all day long would just be waiting to see if the bill would be up on the floor that afternoon. You just didn't know, especially as the session was coming to an end. So again, that is why sometimes you're like, how did that happen? How did it get on the floor? It was on the Rules Committee calendar. It's because they can just take a break and put it on anyway. So that's the Rules Committee. The other things to know is they have crossover day. It used to be 30 days, and I think that they changed it, and I should have looked up to see exactly what it is. But on crossover day, a bill has to make it through one chamber before it can go to the other chamber. So it would have to pass the Senate before the House could then take it up. And that is so, I think it's in part a mechanism for the House and the Senate to make sure that the other chamber is passing their bills. And it's to make sure that you're spending time at the end of the year on bills that can actually pass. So you might hear a lot of times, well, it didn't make it through on crossover day, so the bill is dead. And then you're thinking, but they pop up some other way. How does that happen? So again, there's lots of maneuvering that people can do. So the way they get around that is they make amendments to bills that are moving. So there's a couple of ways to do that. One is you can add an amendment to any bill that is germane. So any bill that is on that same general topic. What a lot of lobbyists will do is if they have a bill they really want to pass, they will look at the way the bill is written. So what statutory provision are you amending? So if you're amending, I'm just going to throw out, I don't even know what this is in Georgia, Title 17. and your bill didn't make it through on crossover day, you then go to the House, if it didn't make it through the Senate, you then go to the House and you look at every single bill that is in Title 17, and you figure out how you can get your bill onto that one because it's the same title. Or you look through every bill that has a similar topic and you figure out a way, if there is a way to amend that bill and get your bill on it. So you might even push a bill you don't care about just so that you can amend it with your amendment. So that's how some things pop up at the end, because they're germane to other bills that are still moving. Another thing you can do is you can strip out the language of an old bill and put in language of your bill. So you might look and say, oh, this bill's about Title 17. And actually what I'm going to do is strip all of the content out of that bill and put my Title 17 language in that bill, and then it's already made it through a chamber, and now my bill is in it. So that's how you add things at the end. And then if the bill is different, so say I pass a bill, I have a bill in the Senate, and then it gets amended in the House, it does have to go back to the Senate to get approval on that amendment. And if you can't have agreement, this is where it gets a little bit complicated. There can be lots of ways to sort of resolve those, which is a little bit more complicated. But I did want to just make sure that you had those basics of what the Rules Committee is, how the Rules Committee works, and how you can add things at the end. So I hope that it's a little in the weeds, but I think helpful when you're trying to understand what the heck is happening at the legislature. So I'll leave it there. And I'm happy to take questions if folks have them. I know I just gave you a ton of information, but happy to answer questions should you have some.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Let's see, I checked, and right now there are no questions in the Q&A. So for those who are attending remotely, please type in any questions you have in the Q&A on the bottom of your Zoom meeting. If any of the attendees, please, Mary Beth, go ahead.
Okay, so say a bill gets through both the House and the Senate, can it be rescinded?
So if it makes it to the House and the Senate, the governor can veto it. But that is really the only way without going through the process again, right? So SB 140 passes. Other than going to court over that bill, you would have to start from the beginning in the next session, introduce the bill that would rescind it and go through the whole process again. So you can rescind a bill, you just have to go through the full process all over again. So
if only one House passes it, can it be rescinded in that House before it gets approved by the other House? So say the Senate passes a bill and it goes over to the House side, but then the Senate decides they really don't want to move on it. Sometimes, I mean, depending on how the relationship is, the Senate leadership could say, like, we really, really don't want you to take up this bill. And then the speaker could listen to that or not listen to that. Also, sometimes what happens is a bill sponsor themselves will say, I don't want to move forward on that. So sometimes you'll see situations, and this could have had something to do with the Don't Say Gay bill, because they changed the bill a lot before it went to the hearing where it got where it was killed. A bill sponsor might say something like, I just learned something new, or I know that this is going to get amended, or I've made a deal with somebody over here, and then they can withdraw their bill or like withdraw support for their bill. And usually if you don't have someone sort of shepherding it through, then the bill sort of just goes away because no one is advocating for it. I had asked because Georgia had passed, the resolution to have a new constitutional convention.
Oh.
And if that goes forward, and if there are enough states that agree to that, it's probably the beginning of the end for religious freedom in this country. I mean, it will be the end of religious freedom because it's being pushed by the Christian nationalists. So I was just wondering, since it's already gone through, approved by both houses, is there a way to kind of undo that?
Oh, so it's gone through, I don't think I knew about this. So it's gone through both chambers. Did it go through both chambers on the same? So the other thing to know is the session goes in 2-year periods, right? So this year started a new one. So every bill has to pass both chambers within that 2-year period. So if it passed last year during the prior legislative session, the prior, it's not even just a session, but if it passed in the 2020-2021 year, then it still would have to start over in I guess what it should be 2021-2023. It would still have to start over in 2023, even if it passed last year.
I don't know. It's just when I was looking at Common Cause and having. I just came back from the American Atheist Conference that was in this weekend, so they were talking about this is the big issue in front of all of us. It's
Okay.
preventing this constitutional convention because people don't have to be elected to participate in it or anything like that. So, you know, when they were talking, they just said Georgia is one of the 30 states that has approved, you know, going forward with this constitutional convention. And there aren't that many more states before it will happen.
Yeah, that would be not great. It would not be good.
No. Yeah, and there's already 30. Right.
I'll ask, actually, I'll ask Nick to check on this and look into the states and see sort of where things are. So I'll take that to Nick and ask him to look into it. Thank you.
As far as which year it was passed, and I don't know. Oh, I know.
Yeah, well, if it's to amend the U.S. I was thinking you were meaning it was for a Georgia constitutional convention rather than a U.S. But that shouldn't have a year. I don't know that has a year limit. I don't know. I'll have to look into that.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, Maggie, crossover day is 28.
Thank you. I thought it might have been 28, but then I was like, if I say 28 and then that's also wrong, I'll just say I don't know. Thank you.
All right, Maggie, we did get a question from the audience, the remote audience. I'm going to read it to you, please.
Okay.
Trans women, in parentheses, born male, who want to compete in sports have a distinct advantage over girls in their age group after a certain age. Natural testosterone levels and muscle fiber amounts give this advantage to the trans athlete. How do you think this problem should be resolved?
So what I would say is the issue should be resolved by the medical doctors who give advice, right? So this has become a new issue with like NCAA sports, but they've had a policy on this issue for several years. And I, you know, off the top of my head, I can't speak to it, but it's the sort of thing where if you've had testosterone, you know, if you're looking for a trans woman, if you've had testosterone blockers for a certain amount of time, or I guess male to female, then you can like qualify to compete against other women. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around this. A lot of people who are, if it were true, right, that there was this advantage, it wouldn't be sort of like a one-off of a trans athlete who is really winning a lot of races, et cetera. You just don't see that, right? And this has been a rule in the NCAA for a really long time. So I think that, again, I'm not a doctor and I don't have it in front of me, so I can't really speak to the details and I don't want to say it wrong, but I don't think that it's fully accurate. And I do think that experts are dealing with this. Doctors who are experts actually in this field have been looking into this issue for a really long time. There's lots of recommendations from the medical community. There's rules that have been in place, as I said, by the NCAA that's been there for a really, really long time, and they've been working fine. And so I think it really is because of the rhetoric that's been brought up now that people are getting more outraged. But you know, we've all lived in a world with trans people for a really long time, and we didn't have a lot of these problems. But trans people were using bathrooms, and trans people were playing sports, and it seems like it's sort of a new problem for a particular reason.
Okay, I have a question if nobody else has a question. All right, so regarding private school vouchers, and you mentioned that one Georgia Democrat in the House of Representatives, so she had written an op-ed about this, and I don't know if you've seen it.
I have not.
Okay, so she basically says that, you know, we typically, when we oppose private school vouchers, we talk about the virtues of public schools. However, in many areas of Georgia, the public schools are underfunded. The public schools don't produce good test scores. And we view these voucher programs as kind of the last hope that some of our kids in these schools can get a better education. And you keep telling us that the solution is better public schools, but in the state of Georgia, for example, we have not adopted a poverty weight for school education program, which is one of the few states. So in other words, they're saying is, I hear you talking about the ideal solution, but we're never going to get there given the way our politics works. So we might as well use this kind of lottery system, and at least some of our kids can get a good education. That's the axiom.
Right.
So it's a third constituency besides the libertarians and the white Christian nationalists who are advocating for voucher programs. What do you think that we as advocates of public schools and people from Americans United for Separation of Church and State, what do you think our response to that might be?
Right. So I guess a couple of things. One, it is a little bit of what you were saying, acknowledging our point is, right? But if you're pointing out problems in our public schools, taking more money away from our public schools that do not solve the problem just makes it worse for those public schools, right? So you are not solving any of the problems, you're making them worse. Then, you think about the kids sort of in the worst scenarios now, that is just going to make it worse for the vast majority of kids who are still stuck in that school, right? So you're concerned about those kids, but then you're just taking a few of them out, leaving the kids in that school with even less resources and less opportunity and a bigger problem. So it is really, and even if those kids really do get a benefit, right? So the idea is those kids get out of that school, they go to a private school that, and they're suddenly in a much better situation. But when you look at the way that private school vouchers are set up, this is not going to the best private schools in Atlanta, right? This is going to often pop-up schools or the schools that need vouchers to survive. And that is why the reputable studies of vouchers show that student test scores either go down or they stay the same. They show that there are less opportunities for kids, so fewer tutors, less English language learning programming, less help for kids with disabilities. So you're not actually going to a better school, you're just going to a private school. And so the promise that these kids are getting a better education is a false one. They might not be able to get into a school if their test scores aren't great, if their parents can't pay additional money, if they have discipline problems from their public school, if they're gay, if their parents are gay. So it's, you're really only helping, if even, a very, very small number of kids. I did see her talk on the floor about hamburgers and going to McDonald's and not wanting to go to a place that has really bad hamburgers. My thought on that is, if you own a restaurant that serves really bad hamburgers, the answer isn't to give your money to a different restaurant that you don't own or control or have any say over it. Your answer is to to buy a new griddle, right? Or to do something like that. So she's asking the taxpayers to just give their money to unaccountable private schools that have proven to do less well than the public schools, as bad as the public schools might be doing in a particular area. So I don't know if that fully answers the question. And I understand, right? I understand that kids in a bad situation are looking, and families in a bad situation and a bad public school are really looking for immediate help. I just think that long-term, they are worse for public education, right? The government has to be looking for the most good for the most people. And it really isn't the promise for these kids in that scenario that they think it is. They often ended up in a equally bad situation.
Yes, Tom, go ahead.
I guess I have a very broad cultural question. How do we attempt to understand that so many people seem to believe that we have a Christian nation? And yet I remember taking history classes, and I'm an old Boy Scout, so my Americanism was the idea that, you know, the writers of the Constitution, and certainly people like Jefferson, really strongly believed that we should not become a nation dominated by any religion, and particularly not by any denomination of Protestant Christianity. And yet so many people seem to believe that that's the quote foundation. The founding fathers were strongly Christian. Where do you think this idea comes from?
So I think that the other side has come up with this theory, you know, looking back at Rob Boston, you probably all know of Rob Boston, who's been at AU for a really long time and really focuses a lot on what the other side is saying and sort of their fake historians and David Bartons of the world who are pushing this narrative. I think that they have created this narrative and they are very good at churning it out with their folks, right? So I think that when you go to certain churches and you are in certain circles, this is the narrative you hear, and you're in your close-knit community, and so you just sort of hear that narrative over and over again. I also think that on our side of the issue, we have really shied away from talking about church-state separation as sort of the progressive community, right? So I think a lot of people who are church-state separationists, other than us, right, who are in the room, and me, who has been working on this issue forever, sort of take it as a given, don't really see it as under threat. And then you're kind of like, you know, religion's a personal thing to me. I'm not really going to talk about it. Or like, you know, they kind of, I don't want to bring it up in this debate because I don't want to, you know, trigger the other side. And so we sort of hold that closer. And so I think that while maybe a good short-term goal in some of these debates, we have really caused a problem where it isn't the mainstream discussion anymore because we just sort of didn't talk about it all that much on our side. And so I think at Americans United, we've been talking a lot about a recommitment to church-state separation, and that we at Americans United, we as a nation, we sort of the people in the country need to like reclaim the importance of this, that it is the cornerstone of religious liberty, that it is an American invention, right? Like we came up with this. There's nothing more American than church-state separation. We created it. And so
when you put it on your money, when you have it on your money, when you have it in the pledge, add it to the Pledge of Allegiance, and people have grown up with that.
yeah,
Hearing that, they just assume it's been there since the beginning of civilization, and it hasn't.
yes.
And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No, it's fine.
partly when the government printing it on license plates,
Yep.
and on your coinage, people assume that's America.
Yes.
That's what we're about.
And unfortunately, there's one person in this room who is old enough to remember when that happened.
I remember, I'm older than you.
I remember when my mom told me about it. And I remember her saying how it was so weird when she was in school and suddenly they had to like change the way they pledged the flag. And I remember being like, that's amazing. I had no idea. But yes.
Yeah, there are lawsuits in some states that you don't have to buy a license plate that says "In God We Trust," because you know that's the only option.
Yeah.
All right, so Maggie, we have exceeded your 10-minute Q&A, and I don't want to hold you up from your